Tuesday, the Oklahoma City Council did their budget hearings for three of their biggest departments, which were the fire department, the courts, and the police. And so there's been a group, and we'll talk about them in a bit, who's been kind of putting together information on the Oklahoma City Police Department. We have talked extensively about policing and the various interactions here, but Oklahoma Watch here focused on the positive aspect of it, which is OKC proposes $300,000 to reduce police response to mental health crisis. I believe the Oklahoman had a bit more aggressive headline, but the short of it is that the police are asking for a sizable increase in their budget. It is upwards of almost $230 million a year that we are putting towards policing. I watched the presentation, made some public comment. One of the things I thought was interesting that they didn't do this year that they did last year is they typically report back like how they're doing. They give you like a status update, like this is how many crimes we've solved, this is the percentage of things we get done. And like they didn't do that this year, and I thought that was interesting. This year was a very kind of, for a government budget hearing, it was very by the book. You know, it was like, well, you know, last year was rough and we got cut a little bit because of the pandemic. So now we need all that money back. Plus we got all this extra work we think we've got to do. So just, you know, give us more money. That's very typical of governmental organizations. But I think what's interesting about the request for money in that sense, though, without, especially when you divorce it from what are you doing with that money or how are you doing it, is that, you know, last year they report that the police don't solve nearly as many crimes as I think one might think. They solve maybe a quarter of property crimes. They solve, you know, half, maybe less of all murders. So there's a lot that I think could be left to be desired in the police's performance. They also do a lot of, you know, a lot of their stuff goes into like more the routine enforcement of stuff that, again, I think most citizens probably aren't super enthused about, like routine traffic stops, kind of messing with people, in my opinion. Like, I get it. We don't like people speeding down our streets, but like, you know, if you've ever been pulled over for going like 8 over on an empty street by a cop at the end of the month, does that help public safety? I think there's an argument there. So anyway, yeah, they post pictures of children shoplifting on Twitter. And then, of course, you know, the one thing that was totally absent from the budget presentation is any accountability or admission or attempt to address their position as number 2 in the country for the number of police killings. And the 2 very high-profile murders that have happened in the last 6 months, where police officers are now being charged with for the killings. No discussion of that. No how we're going to fix this. No how we're going to solve this. No, we're changing, you know, how we do stuff. Like, it was just a very by the book. And then they spent over half the presentation. So they didn't give you much detail on their performance or what they plan to do with all that money. But then they spent the rest of it with doing like videos on like how great the police are. Now I can't remember what the first video was, but the second one I thought was kind of interesting because, you know, in polling, mental health concerns come up in the community a lot because I think we all know people with mental health issues, and those of us who have had to deal with it, know that there are no good options out there. Like, the few social services we have are way overextended, and the police are like the first thing you have to call, and they don't make it better. But they showed a video of a cop literally saying like, yeah, the best part of my job is how I get to go answer these calls. And it was like a stage deal with like somebody who was like, I mean, it was probably all fake, like just made up, but a guy experiencing some mental health issue. And what is the police officer? What services does he connect that person with? You know, 20 minutes of FaceTime on an iPad. I am no expert in mental health treatment, but I'm going to guess somebody who is like experiencing a massive mental health crisis, who lives alone, you know, has a lot going on in their life and maybe not a lot of support, I'm not sure that like a FaceTime is like really the level of service that they need to like get them from point A to point B. I mean, is it better than like tasing them and arresting them and throwing them in the county jail? Yes. But I don't think we should stop at the iPad service model myself. And that's what they're proposing. Like, that's their big idea is like, hey, man, we got iPads. Like, have a chat.
Well, and that's like so. As someone, I consider myself a mental health expert. Just kidding. But as someone who has like gone through so much like mental health experiences, and like mental health emergencies too, it's like it takes a certain level of trust to like speak to a mental health professional in that situation, and it takes the right environment. So if you're like expecting someone to be like, here's a police officer giving someone an iPad and then they're like sitting there, that's not a conducive environment. Like,
Sit in the
even,
back of a police cruiser while
yeah,
you're.
you're
Got
like,
it.
well, this
Cool.
is what I'm feeling. Like, no. And it takes time and it takes more. Like, a 20-minute session isn't gonna do jack. Like, a 20-minute session with my therapist, who I've seen forever, wouldn't do jack. Like, that's not where things progress. Like, diagnosis take time. Like, I went through probably like 3 years trying to find like my actual mental health disorder and my actual like diagnosis, and then treatment takes forever. Like, it is such a thing that you need compassion, you need time, and you need connection to develop a good mental health like strategy. And so it's never going to happen with a brief 20-minute session or whatever. And it's like, maybe instead of dispatching a police officer, you dispatch the person who's on the other end of that iPad.
Right. Pay them to show
Pay
up
them,
and
you
do
know?
on-call site visits. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, it's just, uh, it's like, are they really this bad at what they do? And like the sad answer is probably yes. But then it's also just, I mean, like people have been saying this forever. Like, again, it goes back to what you were saying about the legislators. Like, they didn't just wake up and this is the first time, like, oh shit, we have a mental health crisis in the United States of America? What? I mean, police officers have been answering these calls for 20 fucking years, dragging people off to Griffin or dragging people off to the jail or dragging people off to God knows where, at some wildly inappropriate percentage, beating or tasing or shouting or cussing at these people. And like now it's like, hey, kinder, softer. Now we got iPads. Like, come on. I mean, it's
Yeah.
just it's like maybe just knock all that other crap you were doing off and
Mhm.
give up some of your funding and don't even take those calls. Like we're not even calling you
Yeah.
people. Get it out of your purview.
Well, and it's like, there's I mean, I've had like mental breakdowns. I'm an overshare if our people can't tell already. But like, I have had those mental breakdowns, and someone in that like place would not have helped. And I have seen other people in that situation, and I'm telling you, they don't get violent. Like, they might on
No.
occasion, but they are not in places where they need to be restrained. They're not in places where they need to try to explain. Like, it is hard for me to process what is happening in those moments enough to explain to like my partner or my parents or my mental health professional, much less some like dude who's showing up with a gun and handcuffs. And like, that's how can I communicate effectively to that person what I am feeling, what the cause of this is, what the solutions to these are? Because it's like that language doesn't exist for people, or at least for myself, when I'm having that. Like, language does not communicate what I'm feeling. There doesn't seem to be words. And so like, trying to explain yourself to somebody who doesn't have that innate language that mental health professionals learn isn't useful.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so it's a frustrating thing that it makes headlines. I mean, 300,000 out of a $230 million budget is nothing. They could do way more. They could do way better. They could give up some of their budget and fund a totally different department that does this. There's just no imagination in what they proposed. And so Yeah, Oklahoma Watch's article really, reading it now a little more closely, really isn't that great on it. I can't remember if it was the Frontier or maybe even the Oklahoman that just ran a much more critical article just saying that, like, you know, like, this isn't the first time y'all are hearing about this. Maybe you need to do better.